Good end-of-life planning is part of exercising faithful stewardship around all with which God has entrusted to us. And wow, can it also make a huge and positive relational impact. Welcome to the Q4 Impact Podcast, where through scripture, story, and conversation, we inspire you to make an impact all the way through the fourth quarter of your life. Estate planning. It's something that hits our radar more often and perhaps with more urgency as the years go by. But there's so much support to give it attention in the proverbial sooner than later. Last week in our podcast, Ron and I discussed what we called estate planning for the soul, all of the areas worthy of consideration apart from our finances. But today we are going to be discussing the more common items that come to mind when we think of estate planning. As you can see if you're watching online, we are also privileged to be joined today by an attorney by the name of Peter Wakeman. Ron and I have both been privileged to work with him through the years, and Peter is the president of Wakeman Law Group in California and is a certified specialist in estate planning, probate, and trust law. In addition to his extensive knowledge and expertise, we believe you are also going to benefit today from his ability to both understand and integrate the personal and emotional side of all of the decisions that come along with estate planning. So, Peter, thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Ron and Susan, for having me. Well, this is, I've been looking forward to this one for a while now. I want to start with the obvious. Estate planning has to do with planning for our death. And let's face it, it's not a topic many of us enjoy thinking about, yet that doesn't detract from the importance of it. So how would you encourage someone to begin thinking about this the preparation for themselves and for their loved ones?
Well, I think first we have to realize that death is inevitable. Many of my clients tell me they're going to live forever, and they apparently know something I don't. But not planning is really ignoring reality. And so even if you don't have a plan, the state has a plan for you, and you may not like what the state decides to do with your assets after you're gone. And the thoughts and opinions expressed today are just general concepts. I'm not intending for anyone to take this as legal advice. If you have a legal question or problem, you need to consult with your own lawyer. You need to be proactive if you want to control what happens to your hard-earned wealth when you're not around anymore, to make sure that it goes to those that you love and care about, whether those are family members, friends, causes, whatever it may be. And the important secondary areas, planning's not only about death, but about incapacity. Most of us will be incapacitated for some period of time prior to our deaths. We'll wish to die a peaceful death in our sleep, but that's not always the way it happens. In that case, in the event of you're incapacitated, you want to make sure that you've got somebody in charge of both your finances as well as your healthcare decisions. So in the event you should get to a point in your life where you're no longer able to make decisions for yourself, you want to make sure that you've got documentation in place so that somebody else can make those decisions for you, and ideally make the decisions that you would make if you were competent to make those decisions. If you don't put somebody in charge of making decisions in case of incapacity, you're in legal limbo, and the courts are going to have to intervene. And so that's something that needs to be addressed as part of any well-considered estate plan.
Just hearing you speak, Peter, you just hear the soberness that comes with it. And it's a stage of life around which there are some hard decisions to make. And yet, as I shared in the beginning, it does benefit us if we do this type of planning sooner than later. So I'm going to ask you to speak to some of those benefits and why it's important? And if you don't do it, what are some of the risks?
So the hard part is death is obviously a traumatic event, and those who are left behind are oftentimes grief-stricken. And so the goal of a well-considered estate plan is to make at least the financial aspect of it, the asset transfer aspect of it, as time efficient and cost efficient as possible. In other words, you don't want to compound the grief by making the settlement of one's estate more costly than it needs to be or more time consuming than it needs to be. Now, typically that means structuring your estate plan in a way that avoids probate. And what probate is a court process where if someone dies, then the court has to step in to decide who's responsible for that deceased individual's estate, who's responsible for gaining control of the assets, making sure tax returns are filed, making sure creditors are paid, and ultimately making sure the assets get distributed to the beneficiaries in accordance with the decedent's wishes. The problem is the probate process in many states. I happen to live and work in California, and the probate process in California is not time efficient, nor is it cost efficient. The average probate in California takes about 18 months to settle an estate. The lawyer for the estate gets paid based on a percentage of the value of the estate. So it's just not a very time efficient or cost efficient way to distribute assets when one dies. Now, the probate laws are different state to state. In some states, Texas is one that I happen to be familiar with. Probate takes only 2 or 3 weeks. So if you're a Texas resident, probate avoidance is not typically a big consideration as part of one's estate plan, but certainly in a state like California, it is a big consideration. The other issue relates to taxes, and sometimes people get probate and taxes confused, and they're really two separate issues. As I mentioned, probate is a court process, whereas the taxes are typically dictated by federal law. Some states have their own estate or inheritance taxes. California does not. And the federal tax exemptions are pretty generous. Right now, it's $13.6 million for an individual that they can leave to their beneficiaries without having to worry about any estate taxes. So for most of us, we don't have estates in excess of $13.6 million. So tax considerations are really not the primary driver of the estate planning process. It's more thinking about, cost efficiency and time efficiency.
So I believe there may be other reasons that this important task doesn't get done. And perhaps someone feels like, well, gosh, I don't really have that much in the way of finances, so why bother and go through the trauma of meeting with an attorney? But planning for our passing involves a lot more than what happens to our bank accounts. So what are some of the other critical decisions involved in an estate plan?
Well, even if you don't have a large estate, you should still be the one to decide what happens to your assets when you die. Again, in the absence of you planning your estate, the state has a plan for you, and that the state's plan may not reflect your wishes. So you may have minor children, and they're going to need a guardian to oversee their money, and you probably don't want them, getting all of their inheritance at 18, right? So most clients would want their assets set up in a trust for their kids until they're older, more mature, probably through with school, possibly married, starting a family, things where they're likely to make better financial decisions with their inherited assets than they would if you gave them all to them, gave it all to an 18-year-old. You may have a child with special needs where they really need lifetime supervision of their inherited assets. And you may have adult children who frankly just aren't that responsible, and you may not want to entrust them with managing what it is you're going to leave to them. You may have pets. Oftentimes our clients want to make provisions to make sure their pets are placed in a suitable adoptive family with enough money to support the pets. You may have a favorite, charity or charities, whether it's your church or some other worthy organization that you support. You may want to provide for those organizations, through your estate plan. The bottom line is you just want to make sure your assets go where you want them to go, and you want them to go in the most time and cost efficient manner possible. And there are a lot of different ways to plan an estate. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be formal documents. For example, if you have a bank account and you list a beneficiary on your bank account, then that bank account will go to that beneficiary when you die, and it doesn't go through probate. So that's a form of an estate plan, is listing a beneficiary on a bank account. Same's true with life insurance policies or retirement accounts or any asset of that type where you can name a beneficiary. You can also have a will. That's sort of the traditional way that people have planned their estates through the years. And the problem is, as we talked about, the will oftentimes will have to go through probate. And for clients who have, a little bit more in assets, they might want to consider having a living trust. So a living trust is a way that you can transfer your assets to your beneficiaries without them having to go through probate. And typically for somebody who owns real estate, a house or any other type of real property, a living trust is going to be the best option for them in terms of avoiding probate and making sure the assets go where they want them to go.
Thank you for providing such just practical guidance, because it is, you're right, the definitions of such, and we hear the terms and people can just be reticent to feel like they even know where to begin. And so breaking it down like you have is very helpful. I know, Peter, that when we spoke in preparation for this episode, it was very apparent to me in that conversation that your role does encompass so much more than just preparing legal documents like a living trust. You also, I think this is one, I know you've worked with Ron and me, you come alongside in a true partnership to give us insight of how the decisions that are being made could influence relational dynamics within a home. So what are some of these other relational or personal issues that you regularly see and that should or should not be attempted to be addressed in an estate plan?
Well, it's interesting. Sometimes I feel my role is as much therapist as it is lawyer, because, oftentimes there are family dynamics that, need to be considered in terms of the client's estate plan. I try and make sure that clients are realistic about what they can accomplish through their estate plan. I mean, after all, these are legal documents, and rarely do legal documents successfully control the behavior of beneficiaries. Your kids are who they are, and the estate plan isn't going to change who they are. And oftentimes, I think clients have an unrealistic expectation of what they can accomplish through these legal documents. I mean, a lot of times they're trying to use the estate plan to control their kids, protect their kids, punish their kids, reward their kids, and in various ways. And rarely is an estate plan successful in accomplishing those things. So, by way of an example, clients oftentimes want to draft their estate planning documents in a way that will incentivize certain behavior. So, for example, they may have distributions for education if they think education is important, or may have distributions to match a child's earned income if they think a work ethic is important, things of that nature. And in my experience, 40 years of experience and drafting 12,000 plus estate plans over the years, the reality is the kids who need the incentives, those who need the motivation, are not motivated by the incentives. And the kids who don't need the incentives don't need the incentives. They're self-motivated. And so the notion that somehow you're going to change your children's behavior through how you go about drafting your estate planning documents just is not realistic. The other thing is you want to be careful about the message that your estate plan sends to your children after you're gone. So you need to think about, are the values that I'm reflecting in my estate plan and what those values say about how I perceive my children and their strengths and weaknesses, is that going to cause them to be mad at each other? So, for example, if one child is treated one way and another child a different way, is that going to damage the relationship between those two kids after you're gone? So will one child feel less loved than another or less trusted than another? The one thing I do encourage clients to do is, if you're going to do something a little bit non-traditional, like an incentive trust or things of that nature, that you communicate your wishes with your children in advance. The reality is most clients don't want to discuss these issues with their kids because they don't want the pushback. They don't want to create unnecessary family disharmony by communicating their real thoughts and desires to their children in advance. And unfortunately, that leads to unmet expectations and disappointment. So if children have a certain expectation of what's going to happen when mom or dad dies, and ultimately the documents reflect something different than what the child expected, that's going to potentially lead to legal action by the aggrieved child. So I think it's important for clients to be transparent with their kids about their estate planning, notwithstanding the fact that, those are difficult conversations to have.
I've now been through the passing of all four of my wife, my parents, and now starting in on another level where my brother's wife recently passed. And so I've been through a number of these experiences pretty intimately. And I'm just so thankful to know that I'm not quite finished yet with my own preparation, but I'm pretty close. And meaning that I have my documents in order, but there's some added specifics that I need to just tie up and finish. But boy, it is such a delicate time of life. And, the bank accounts, the assets are one thing, but the relationships can be so damaging when things aren't thought through. And I think having an estate plan, it kind of forces you to want to look at things as is going to happen when the event occurs. if you have three children that have to have your things divided, that's a delicate scenario depending on the nature of your three children. And the more specific you are with your wishes, I think the more you eliminate the possibilities of really affecting relationships when you're gone. And so I don't know, can you talk I'm sure you've had so many experiences of the danger of not having things done versus the benefit of being thorough.
Yeah, I mean, those are all really, really good points. Most parents, I think, are unrealistic about the relationship that their children have with each other. There's, sibling rivalry is not unusual. In fact, I would say it's pretty typical. And children tend to be on their best behavior around their parents. And so oftentimes there's a lot of rivalries that may exist sort of subsurface among the kids that the parents either don't want to recognize or is some way concealed from them. And what they have to realize is their death is not going to improve those relationships, right? Their death is going to exacerbate the relationships. So if the kids are on their best behavior around mom and dad, when mom and dad are gone, then it's the gloves come off. And so you need to think about, if you have an estate that's cash, cash is easy. Cash you can split up and each kid can go their separate way. But if you've built an estate like many clients have around real estate or a family business or things of that nature, you need to think about the reality of your kids being in partnership with each other, right? And sometimes that's a recipe for disaster because they don't get along with each other. Sometimes they don't trust each other. There's all these rivalries that we talked about. So I think it's important, as you have, Ron, for clients to really think that through in terms of how they're crafting their documents.
Peter, I have another question that I know is probably common to many, because I've had friends tell me when they're about to leave town that they want to just draft their last wishes, should something happen to them while they're away. And the question that's always been in my mind when I hear that are, what are the legal requirements for those last wishes to actually be recognized and followed? And are there best practices that you would recommend, especially for those that may not be able to afford to work with an attorney?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, a will does not need to be a formal document. All 50 states recognize something that we call holographic wills. And what a holographic will is it's basically a document that needs to be entirely handwritten. In other words, it can't be typed on a computer. It needs to be written out longhand and signed and dated. And in all 50 states, that's a valid will. So if you're, leaving on a trip tomorrow and you want to make sure that you have something in place, that would be my suggestion, is sit down and handwrite a will about, what you want and sign it and date it and give it to somebody, in the event something unfortunate happens in your absence. There's also lots of online document preparation services. I mean, LegalZoom is probably the best known, and those prepare perfectly valid legal documents for somebody that has a fairly simple, and straightforward situation. So for clients who want something more comprehensive than a holographic will, I would suggest using LegalZoom or one of those other online document preparation services because they can also, prepare powers of attorney, which, as we talked about at the outset, are important documents, not in case of death, but in case of incapacity.
Good, thank you.
This is such a practical discussion. And as I'm listening to you, things that folks just don't think about is, mom has one wedding ring. And are there 3 daughters or 2 daughters or a daughter and a son? How do you divide one wedding ring? Dad has a 65 Mustang and has 4 kids. Who gets the Mustang? Or maybe he has 2 Mustangs and 3 kids. And so the money part, the finances is maybe a little easier in some ways, but there's also treasures that have to be divided up. And this just it's for me, it feels like it's all about communication and what an opportunity it is, though there's risk, but putting all of these things out and being able to do it beforehand and ensure that your children don't get into tremendous arguments over who gets what. So it's so important. But as we begin to head towards the end, I want to acknowledge that our conversation today it's been different than what the topics we usually cover. But I really want to say something, that this is not a non-spiritual topic. God has so much to say in his word about being a good steward and exercising diligence in how we manage the important parts of life. And this is as important a topic as any topic. And so having a proper plan in place for the end of your life is just, in my mind, is just incredibly important. I'm going to quote 1 Timothy 5:8. Anyone who does not provide for their relatives, and especially for their own household, has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So, I would say it's not only providing things, but it's providing it in a way that makes it less risky for your survivors. So the context of this verse was directed towards taking care of family members unable to take care of themselves. I believe it also reflects the principle of just faithfully managing all we have, because we recognize that it all belongs to the Lord, and we simply have been entrusted with it. So our prayer is that today's conversation will push you and motivate you to take action on your end-of-life planning. Please don't leave your heirs with a mess. And through your inaction, open the door to arguments and disagreements among siblings and children and spouses. And Susan, I don't know if you're going to do this, but please, I'm going to ask you to do this. We've been working with Peter for I don't know how many years, a long time, and I get to recommend folks from time to time. And I say this, I don't think I've ever said it in front of Peter, but there's really no one that I recommend higher to get this done than Peter. There's no he's just has done such a phenomenal job for me and our family. And so I'm hoping, Susan, that you'll give him a little plug with his contact information. And he hasn't asked us to do this. We don't get a commission from anything. It does my heart just wonderful to know that someone's going to be in good hands and take care of this very, very important topic.
Yes. And I am already planning to do that. And I'll share a little bit more as we wrap up at the end. I do have one more thing that I want to say, that I think is important. And Ron, you've talked about our working with Peter numerous times through the years, and that drives home this point. And that is, once an estate plan is in place, it's not like sometimes people set up their plan for a 401k. It's not a set it and forget it. This is something that needs to be reviewed every few years to ensure that the laws haven't changed, that everyone that you are relying on in some form or fashion is still willing and able. And as both Peter and Ron have expressed, an estate plan is not really about money, but it's ultimately about relationships and the hearts of those that you love. And Ron, I love the verse that you shared, because God's greatest interest is in our hearts. And so it makes sense to give this topic the time and the attention that it deserves, because it does put you in alignment with the heart of God, I believe. So Peter, is there anything else that you want to share on this topic before we wrap up?
Well, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it's important that your estate plan be reviewed every few years, as difficult as that is to do. Our lives are dynamic. And in terms of our family relationships and our assets, and they're constantly changing. And I think it's important to make sure that your estate plan reflects your most recent intentions and desires.
Yeah, thank you for reinforcing that. So again, thank you for listening today. As Ron said, a little unique, but still in line with our desire to apply biblical wisdom to the practical aspects of life. So we appreciate you joining us and hope that you have gleaned a lot from Peter's knowledge and experience. And for those that may want to know more about how to contact Peter, he is located again in Southern California and is president of the Wakeman Law Group. Am I right in saying president?
Yep.
Okay. I wanted to make sure I had your title right. His information will be in our show notes. So tune in again next week, because what we will be doing together is providing another biblical approach for you to persevere in the waves and the storms that hit inevitably in every life. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Q4 Impact Podcast. To continue receiving encouragement and practical tips on how to live with purpose and meaning through the many changes and challenges of life, please be sure to subscribe. And please share it with others you think may also benefit.